Good. Looks like we are live. Amazing. Good. Welcome, everyone. If you're joining us, say hello. Don't feel shy to chat with us in the chat box on LinkedIn. We're just really happy to be here. I'm so thrilled to be doing a webinar. It's been a little while that I've actually done a webinar or even gone live on the platform. So really glad to be here and with my colleagues, Cass Spong from Entheos, and I've got Katie O'Keefe from Structured Creative. So thank you both for being here. And basically, before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge me being here in Melbourne, Australia, and along with Cass and Katie, wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and the Woiwurrung people. I think that it's so important to acknowledge our traditional owners, especially in the space of sustainability and with the topic that we're talking about today, which is that integrated process of well-being, sustainability, and change management, which is really about people and our connection to each other, as well as our connection to the environment. So environmental social systems can benefit wholeheartedly from the wisdom of our traditional owners. And so I think that this is a really important part of this conversation today. And I'm really glad that all of you here are joining us to be a part of this conversation. Thanks, James. Thanks, Alison, for being here. Just say hello as you join and ask questions along the way. It's going to be a really casual conversation. We're not, trying to present a whole heap of slides and be super structured around this. We're actually trying to really have an organic and real conversation today. So I'm going to let Cass, if you could, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. So I've got my own business, Entheos Consulting, which I've been doing for the last 12 years. For the last really 25 years, I've been really interested in organisational well-being and systems, and working in the space of consulting and leadership and facilitation. So that's really me. I work with the Centre for Wellbeing Science as well, so that's an honorary fellow there, and so that's very much about this work around how can we cultivate systems of wellbeing where we're not just looking at individuals, but we're looking at how all the stakeholders thrive, and that's some of the work that Katie and I have been also doing together.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Cass. It's so important to listen to our stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Katie, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, Meryl. Thank you. And this is so fun. This is a first for me, doing a live streamed webinar. So this is really cool. Hi, Kath. It's lovely to have you. So Kath English has just commented. I know Kath quite well. One of the fun things I do in my life is I teach people handstands. And so Kath and Cass do handstands with me. Look, my passion in life and work is to help people be great. And I do that by really helping people be great in three very distinct ways. The first is, how do we show up as our best selves every day in our life and in our work? And so that really, for me, draws in human and individual well-being and the way in which our bodies work as a system to enable us to be at our best. So there's a systems element to that. The second thing that I like to work on and help people with is, how do we make teams be great? If I'm working as part of a team, how do we help teams to be at their best? And teams are a complex system. I've been doing some research for the last 5 years with Monash University into what does make a great team. And we have indeed found from that research that teams are complex adaptive systems, and well-being is something that emerges within part of that system. And then the third thing I do very specifically with Cass is, how do we help people be great in the context of an organisation as a system? So when we're embedded within a much bigger organisation that has an influence on how we think and feel and behave, how do we establish the systems in that organisation so that well-being is able to emerge for all the components of that system, not just individuals?
Yeah. Amazing. I love that. So there's three tiers to that: the individual, the team, and then within the context of the organization. And I'm going to use that to springboard a little into what we're talking about today, because the reason that we connected in the first place is I come from the ESG space, the sustainability space, and I really want to change the rhetoric around this. Like, we're not just trying to be consultants, come in and give a pretty looking report. It really is so much more than that. And changing the way that people think and make decisions and act on those decisions. And also, what are those cognitive biases that impact them in that process of making those decisions? And then how to actually embed that in the long term and progress through that system of change, that process of transformation through ESG, circular economy. It really is so important and so heavily predicated on the people, which is where you guys come in. You guys are the people experts, and often that piece is missing from my space of work. And so I'm really glad that we could have this conversation. Welcome, Josie. Thanks for being here. Got Josie Gibson on the call as well. So as I said, feel free to ask questions along the way. But I think to kick us off, I think what I might ask you guys from your perspective is, people systems. Like, what do you feel is sort of like the biggest challenge about getting people to adopt a new system?
Do you want me to go, Eddie?
Yeah, go, Cass. Yep, absolutely.
Because, I like to go back and actually think about, why are we even, having AEST goals? Like, the whole idea, the reason that we have them, and we have to think about this, is because of the way organisations have been operating, for the last 100 odd years. So we go back and we look at that and like, what is the foundation of that around, it was all about mass production. It was all about continuous growth, where efficiency was the thing that we valued. And then later that got taken over with more, it's all about the shareholder return at the expense of all the other stakeholders. And then when you have a look at like things like the science of management and Taylorism, Frederick Taylor was in the, early 1900s, and he's had a huge influence. And he continues, like some of his underlying assumptions about an organisation as a machine, because he was a mechanical engineer and thought that you could just engineer organisations and not recognise they're actually, as Katie said, complex adaptive systems. Some of these underlying assumptions are still there and they're really present within our organisations, but a lot of them, they're not conscious. And so I think, going back to your question, one of the most challenging things is really doing that full culture change to shift mindset so that we start to understand that we are part of a complex adaptive system. We're connected to the land, where we have shared responsibility to each other. And it's almost an unlearning that we have to do around how we've been taught to deal with complex problems. We've been taught to think about them in a very reductionist way and break them down into small manageable pieces, when that's not actually how complex systems behave.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what was the name of the gentleman you mentioned? Who's the engineer?
Frederick Taylor. So a lot of people might have heard of the science of management. So Frederick Taylor, I think that a direct quote from him was that we don't want to encourage behaviour where people are taking their own initiatives. We want them to follow orders. So this is on a production line. Some of this has continued within our organisations, yet the context has changed dramatically. And when
you cut out a little bit there. So you were saying that he was applying this knowledge of like systems, being a part of the process line and following the instructions as an engineer. That was back in his day. He was embedding that thinking. But you're saying that now that really is still prevalent in our business, our workplace. Really, is that what you're saying?
Yes. I think there's still a lot of that unconscious belief, and it's not. And people, when you say that to people, they're like, no, that's not how we work. But when you start to unpack some of the things that we do, and for example, I used to do HR transformation with a Big Four consulting firm, and one of the things that we would always do is set up shared service centres where you were breaking down tasks into small manageable tasks so that you could, have tier 1, tier 2, so that you could easily train and replace people. And that mentality is very much based on the science of management and how Frederick Taylor thought about people as part of a production process, the machinery of an organisation, not as a living complex system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Katie, do you have anything to add to that and your thoughts as well on systems? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
repeat.
totally.
I've forgotten my question. Taking on change.
So, and it's really funny. I think one of the things you said before around, we write a plan and then how do we actually make that happen? What that brought up for me is, how do we close the knowing doing gap? And so much of what we do in our lives, we think to ourselves, I should do this, I should do that, I should do this. We know all the things that we should do. And Tony Robbins has this really funny saying where he says, I should all over myself. But we don't do it. And so how do we shift from knowing we should do this thing to actually taking action on it? And the experience that Cass and I have had is people have to see their role in it. They have to be able to take ownership for their role. And there has to be a level of efficacy around, if I do this thing, I know I'm going to get the outcome that I need. And that has to be underpinned by a deep sense of why. Like, what's the real benefit and reason? And one of the things with change that really frustrates me is this, like, what's the burning platform? Because a burning platform creates fear, and fear drives a fight or flight response, which isn't necessarily means you're taking action in the way we want to take action. And often fear means I'm just not going to do anything. And so, look, when I take that analogy of a burning platform, if I'm standing on a burning platform in the middle of the ocean and there's nothing for me to jump to, am I really going to jump off that platform, or am I going to try and put out that fire? Right? It's like, give me something better to jump to. Don't just give me a burning platform. Give me something better. If I'm on a burning platform and there's an amazing cruise ship over there, sure, I'll jump off the platform to get on the cruise ship.
So can you explain that a little bit more for us, like either for the rest of us, really, what you're saying is, how does this apply in the business space where, what's the metaphorical burning platform that people are standing on? And why is it that there's a better option for them to get off that platform?
And so if you think about any change that you're trying to institute in the workplace, you're effectively asking people to change. Which is a biological thing. You're asking people to do something differently. And when you ask people to do something differently, that creates a physiological response in us. It generates this stress response, which generates a fight flight. And you don't want people. So if we take this to sustainability, if we talk about sustainability goals always in a fear narrative around, if we don't do this thing, this is the danger, that creates this cortisol spike. It creates this fight flight response in me, which actually means energy goes away from my brain into my body to enable me to respond to that threat. But I'm not thinking clearly, because all my clear thinking is done in this part of my brain. If I'm activated into a stress response, the basic part of my brain's in charge. So I'm not thinking rationally. I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not doing really what you're asking me to do in the way that you're asking me to do it. So how do we shift the narrative to a more positive narrative, to something that's more inspiring to move towards, rather than moving away from something that's fearful? And how do we help people see their role in that?
I love that, because basically what you're saying is, like, even though something is so obvious, it's really good for you, like, pick the apple over the muffin. It's more that, getting that change response to happen and come from an emotional connection, because obviously our emotions are more connected to sort of that basis cognitive bias that we have that we're not even probably aware of. And so even though the apple's better for us, we'll probably pick the muffin because the muffin reminds us of those times that mum used to bake them and leave them on the windowsill. I don't know, that's so like picturesque. Just imagining that. My mum never baked muffins for me. She was not a baker, but I think that's a really important point here, because fundamentally what you're saying is, most of the time, even though we logically know something to be better for us, we'll probably pick the more emotional response. And so that's what is so important in my space of work. And before I go on, I wanted to say thanks, Angela. I can see you're on here, and Josie's mentioned that surfacing the belief systems is is one of those challenges, I guess. And Jonathan Granger, who's mentioned that transformation can be the actual burning platform itself, which is very true. Basically, what you're saying. So I guess what I wanted to say is in my space of work, and we went through that model that we've designed, that Synctus has designed to embed that ESG process or sustainable framework. And there are lots of points along the way where we engage people, we talk to them, and we try to get them to buy into the process. But getting them to flip that whole, changing their mindset from it being just a logical response to also an emotional connection to the response, and the two marrying together essentially. I guess I can say from my perspective, we do, those initial materiality, I guess, stakeholder discussions. And then we involve them along the way to understand, where are your goals as an organization? What are the gaps and the hindrances to moving towards those goals? And then showing them the pathway and then getting them to buy into the pathway. But we do it more from just because, and now we're starting to involve more change management experts, but we do it more from a perspective of, as a leader, you need to be accountable. This is the accountability metric behind it. And there's KPIs and all of those things. So it's very I guess it's very technical is not the word, but it's very logical, going back to those two terms, logical versus emotional. So what are your thoughts on this? How can, say, people like myself who are working in this space and trying to get people to adopt these new systems of thinking and transformation, what are your thoughts about that?
Go Cass.
Yeah. So when you were speaking, I was just thinking about it. It's really interesting territory, because we're talking about complex adaptive systems, but within that, there's a whole lot of complicated problems that do require experts coming in and bringing their expertise to help solve these problems. But as all of these interconnected, all of the complicated problems are interconnected, we're in a much more complex world. So it involves when you're working with complexity, it's not an ordered system. It involves a very different way to approach the change. Rather than just engaging a few stakeholders, it's more around bringing together a whole lot of different voices throughout the system to understand, and getting them to surface and understand what's really going on and what's their role within that surface, that system. Dr. Kathy Allen, in her books, Leading from the Roots, has a really lovely way of looking at organisations and recognising that they are living systems and we can learn from nature. And so she talks about 7 different sort of dynamics that are at play within living systems. And one of them is that a living system will only accept solutions that are created by the system. So this idea that we can go in and sort of control things and control change doesn't actually work within complex systems. So it does take a different way of approaching the problem, recognizing you're in two spaces. You're in complicated plus complexity coming together.
That sounds exciting, but also daunting, I think, for many leaders as well, right? That whole, because you're not in control.
No, you're not in control, but also it's freeing in a way, because it's more based on the reality. You can still do things. You can still nudge the system or attract things in the system. You can still have those conversations with people, support them to see, what is meaningful to them here and now, like the why that Katie was talking about before. That's the thing with living systems. They'll only pay attention to what is meaningful for them in the here and now. So there are ways to work with this, and a lot less frustrating than going in trying to control when it doesn't work.
You know what I might do, Katie? I might ask you to add to what Cass is saying, but from a specific perspective, because I've got James Barnes here who said that, why are we talking about a fear-based driver? So can we change the narrative basically to more of a positive, inspirational driver? Like, how can transformation and change, because it is a positive thing fundamentally, how do we change that? dialogue to get people to take that ownership and take that into their roles and actually drive that change. Maybe
100%. And I totally agree, James. And that was the point I was making before, that if we do talk about change from a fear perspective, that it stimulates that fear response, which actually doesn't drive us towards change. So shifting the narrative to a more positive narrative. And, you know, what you were saying before, and then Cass picked up on that as well, is when we're talking about our sustainability goals and we say, well, where do we want to go? Where are we now? What are the gaps? How do we get there? It's all very logical. It's all very rational. How do we bring that emotional connection into the future state? By not only understanding what are our goals, but what's our vision for that? What's the true why? What's the purpose? And in a way which is really inspiring and taps into people's emotions about, oh my goodness, yes, that is absolutely where we want to be and why we want to be there. Mm-hmm. And then in an organizational setting, that has to cascade through the levels. So individually, there has to be an opportunity for me to explore, why do I come to work every day? Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? And how is the work that I'm doing helping us to achieve that vision? Mm-hmm. And, you know, we've got that really lovely story from NASA. You know, it's such a probably overused story, but it is really lovely around, you know, in the 60s, NASA's trying to put the first man on the moon, and it was a man. Someone's walking through the halls of NASA and sees a janitor and says, what are you doing here? And he turns around and he says, I'm working to put a man on the moon. And so this, like, a janitor who's cleaning the floors sees this connection from my work to the bigger picture. And it sounds so simple. It sounds so 101, but really that's the starting point around that connecting to the why.
Yeah, connecting to the why. Yeah, definitely. I like Josie's correlation to what we're talking about. She's called it a fluid, interconnected constellation. Like, that's how we kind of think of it, where you said living ecosystem. And yeah, essentially it's just that, all back to those things that we're all sort of grappling with now, like God or the universe or energy, whatever it is, like that we're all interconnected fundamentally. So regardless of you working in that role and me in this role, we're connected and therefore we're part of the same thing. And so getting that buy-in is so important. Michelle has said that, you know, can we design organizational systems to create and shift, and what would that look like? So the organizational system itself, I guess maybe Katie, you can talk from your systems work, like from the third part of your work that you mentioned, which is right from the organization. Maybe you can share a little bit about that. Like, how do you create that shift from an organizational level, the top level?
The top level. So, and Cass and I can both talk to this a little bit. There was another thing that Cass was talking about before in terms of the complexity for leaders and how that can just feel so overwhelming. Where do I even start? And one of the sort of principles of complex adaptive systems in learning from nature is that simple rules drive complex behavior. And there's lots of examples of where researchers have looked at complex adaptive systems in nature, like beehives and ant colonies and starlings migrating, and like this is what appears to be very complex behavior. But when they've studied it in detail, there's only 2 or 3 very simple rules driving that very complex behavior. And you can apply that at an organizational level and understanding what are the simple rules in our organization that drive the complex behavior. And we've got some really great examples from the past. And one of my favorite ones is the CIA Manual for Organizational Sabotage from the Second World War. When you read the rules, so this was the handbook to CIA agents during the Second World War to go into enemy organizations and sabotage those organizations. And the rules, the toolkit, the guidelines that they were asked to apply sound like modern day organizations. And so it's things like, and I'll have to find it. I did send it around, but I'll find it again.
Send the link. We can share it with the people here.
I'll send the link. And so it's things like, when a decision is made, frequently revisit that decision and ask to reopen it, to relitigate that decision. Make all decisions by committee and ensure decisions take as long as possible to be made. And so it's these like really funny, and like you read it and you go, oh my God, that's actually not so funny, because that is how most organizations run.
That is crazy.
So, yeah, so crazy. So thinking through from, a systems perspective and spending some time as an organization, well, what are those simple rules that drive our complex behavior, is a really great place to start. And then I'll let Cass talk about the way that we, the way in which we might map the system to find out where those key points of leverage are.
Yeah.
Just before I talk about that, I was also just thinking about so three that I've heard in terms of these principles of guiding principles. Because guiding principles, when you find these rules, these simple rules, they're not completely they have flexibility. Yeah, so there's room to move within them. So they guide behaviour. So the US Marines, for example, they have three when they're out in the field. It's capture the high ground, stay in touch, and keep moving. And so this is what organises a complex system if everyone is following those. And so, yeah, in our organisations, how can we uncover what some of those are that actually support us to be systems of wellbeing, to support each other, to see more of the system. And I think also going back to what you were talking about before on this fear agenda, as soon as we've got this fear and this urgency and this haste, it does narrow our focus, where the very thing that we need to be doing is expanding our focus so that we can start to see what our role is in the wider system and what the interconnections are in the complex system. And so even sort of uncovering and finding some of these these principles around even knowing, slow down, seek perspectives, and having that as, almost like a cultural symbol, to seek perspectives, see your impact, see what your impact is. Also things like having a more experimental mindset, things that encourage that, because you're in complexity. Not everything is going to work. It's only ever a process. So you need to be able to probe and then have something to help you observe the system. And then that's the thing that you do as a team when you're like, oh, what do we do next? Let's actually take a moment to observe what's happening, rather than being on this constant haste that is also reinforcing some of the existing problems within the system, like burnout.
Yeah. Well, I think that leads to something that I always have like such a problem with, which is that most governments, most large organizations, and really most anybody, and even us at an individual level, will put a Band-Aid on something because we're trying to react, we're trying to like hasten to the solution. That's not really the solution, because fundamentally we know if we're, getting a cold every week, well, I don't know, I'm just going to use an example, like taking some medicine for it is not going to be a solution. That's a Band-Aid. But to actually get down to the solution is, are we wearing warm enough clothes, or are we protecting our noses, which is the thing that gets most cold for us in particular? What is that source of that problem, basically, like, and how can we get to that, And I think that's what you're getting at is like, instead of hastening to the solution, let's observe it a little bit more and then get to the source of it.
Yeah, which is part of the work that Katie and I do in terms of working with organisations to map the organisational system collaboratively. So working with a whole lot of different voices and perspectives throughout the organisation to start to surface the interconnections and how things working. So we stop treating the symptoms and we find what the root cause is. And a lot of the time it goes back to what Josie's comment was earlier. It is around some, underlying assumptions and beliefs that are driving the behaviours within the system, and then we often just treat the symptoms, which Katie and I have written about from a wellbeing perspective as well. We do that and say, okay, we're going to support your wellbeing, so here's a yoga program, or you do this. And it's all about just the individual, but then they come back into a system that's toxic.
Back into the system.
Why is 24/7 to be technology, and then it actually reinforces the problem, because people are feeling like, it must be me. The problem is me.
It's funny. I love these organic conversations because sometimes they always seem to allow me the segue. So you brought up well-being, and it's perfect because even just on someone's comment here, Kath English has said, where does change fatigue fit in with so many changes in organizations, not just one change? And I guess, well-being is a topic around that as well. So I think it's a perfect time to start talking about well-being and those individuals as well, and how they are being fatigued by these constant processes.
Yeah, and look, I think change fatigue. I think the reality is we're always in a state of change. We're never stagnant. And even if you think about the earth moves in cycles and stages, nature's always changing. And so I think sort of the idea of being change fit versus change fatigue, I think part of that is about a rewiring of our mental model of what work is going to be like. And even in sitting here, we're not sitting still. You're not going to sit in the same position for an hour. You'll move around to get more comfortable. So change is very natural. There's a really lovely book called Buddhism for Busy People, which sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. But in that, the Dalai Lama talks about this lesson of change is normal. It's human. So let's not sort of get hung up in it. It comes back to this, why are we changing and what are we doing? So I think there's that side of it. And then when we get into, as we think about well-being, so Cass and I really kind of came together on this a couple of years ago when we sort of had a shared frustration around well-being being something that is thought about in an organised setting as just an individual thing. It's something that people need to do by themselves, for themselves, almost as if they're not part of an organisation. And so, Meryl, it might be worth popping up that slide now. So, Cass and I spent quite a lot of time together really thinking about how do we conceptualize well-being in a really different way, to take a systems view. And in that, a complex adaptive system has components of the system and they interact together in ways. Those components interact. And from the interaction of those components, properties emerge. And so in the way that we're characterizing well-being as an emergent property of a complex adaptive system. So well-being actually isn't an outcome that you're seeking. It's not an input. It's not a process. It doesn't belong to any of the components of the system. It emerges from the interaction of the components. And the two real key components that we've identified, and this has come through a process of kind of looking at all the research and then thinking about how can we simplify this into a way that feels digestible. The first component is a human component. There is absolutely a human component to well-being because individuals are significant actors within the system. So, and that human component we think of as human thriving, which is really about the way in which we be in the world. Are we in the world in a way in which we're thriving? Now, really important sort of definition here is thriving doesn't mean we're always blooming. It doesn't mean we're always flourishing. It doesn't mean we're always full of peak energy. And again, if you think about nature goes through cycles of growth and then slowing down. And so you slow down to regenerate, to heal, and then you go through another cycle of growth. So part of this human thriving, and this is in this top circle of self-care and development and being in flow, is recognizing when the time is right for you to be doing different things, when you've got good energy. If you don't have good energy, how do you take a pause to restore your energy? So this self-care and development is the piece where I think most people focus and most organizations focus well-being, is they say well-being is all about self-care. So yes, it is a really important component. So we're not saying that's not important, because it absolutely is important. It's an and. So the second component of human thriving, which I think is we sort of touched on a little bit already, which is about your mindset, your belief systems, your assumptions, the ways in which you direct your energy. And for us, it's all about directing our energy in a way which is about how do I participate in this system with the desire to help all components of the system to be at their best. So this human thriving is not only about how I think about myself and care for myself, but how I think about and care for others. So where do I focus my participation, and what's my intent in that? What's my intention? And then the second component, which is, and thanks, James, we'll talk about that in just a moment, and then I'll hand over to Cass as well. The second component, the big component, is the environment in which we're nested, and we're calling that a regenerative environment. So it's not, it's just not a static environment, but it's an environment which is really about how do we protect and care for the components of the system. And I think when we first connected, Meryl, it was really in this kind of alignment around the work that Cass and I are doing to think about wellbeing as a system and an emergent property as a system, and ESG being really all about how do we create that in the environment through sustainability and through governance, that there's so much overlap between the way we're conceptualizing wellbeing as a system and the goals of ESG.
Well, yeah, very much so, because I guess that, the source of ESG, there's much deeper sources than this, but let's say as it's gone through its iterations of sustainability and social and environmental sustainability, the concept of CSR came about, 20 years ago roughly, and that was about corporate social responsibility. So it was really like trying to say, we finally understand actually people are so important, and our community and the stakeholders and the environments within which we operate are so important. How do we improve that through the way that we invest and make decisions and so on? And then, of course, they found that the CSR concept on its own was not enough, and now we've built that out to things like ESG, and it's just continuing to build out, right? So yeah, it's really interesting because it's been there all along, just in growing kind of intensity, that the people's contribution and their well-being through this process, the people's well-being that impacts the way that they contribute to this process is really important.
Mm. Yeah.
And it reinforces their own well-being through participation in their communities, and having that connection to their why and meaning. And if you look at lots of Indigenous societies that have been, long surviving and sustainable, they measure their well-being based on the health of their relationships, the health of the land, the health of their communities, and they make decisions based on their impact on the natural world and on future generations. Yeah. So, yeah.
And Angela said here that, her view is like that organizations need to be more focused on being change fit, so smarter about how changes are planned. So basically, I think, she's getting at that point of how can we be more proactive rather than reactive. So, helping employees to be generally better, to be more sustainable. Otherwise, people feel like the change is being put on to them or like forced onto them. How do we kind of move to a more proactive way of thinking? Is there some kind of experiences that you guys have had in doing that with helping organizations be more proactive rather than reactive to this?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about something that also Dr. Kathy Allen wrote recently around focusing on the slow variables within organizations. And I think this links a lot with some of the research that you've been doing as well, Katie. So rather than focusing on, all the haste and the urgency, thinking about it like a farmer thinks about the soil and the health of the soil. So we need to have healthy soil over the long term. And every time you try for quick fixes, you actually end up damaging the health of the long-term soil. And so how can we, instead of, support people with the change, and how do we focus on some of these slow variables, which is around how they're interacting, having those authentic relationships, having that trust. And Katie's done some really good research on this around how you actually cultivate those conditions for those emergent properties to emerge. So, Katie, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I will. And I'll just address, James has asked a question a couple of times, what does the S mean on the diagram? Do you want to answer that, Cass?
You do that, yeah. So it's actually a causal loop diagram, James, which is a systems thinking tool. And the S means same relationship. So as one thing increases, the other increases, or if one thing decreases, the other decreases. So as human thriving starts to decrease, the regenerative environment starts to decrease, which once again is a decrease in human surviving. Really showing the interconnection between these things, and they're all reinforcing the same relationship.
Yeah, good. No, that's good. So basically, yeah, the S being represented there is just to show it all sort of goes down at the same time while it all builds up at the same time. Like they're exactly the same. They're directly proportional to each other.
Yep. Yep. And so, and if you think about this in practice, and if we think about the organisation as part of the environment, so individually, if we're showing up in the organisation in a way in which we're really taking care of ourselves and our mindset to participating is one in which we want to help benefit everyone, us showing up in that human thriving way has an influence on the system. It helps the system to thrive. It helps the system to be regenerative. But if we show up individually in a way which either, we're not looking after ourselves, we're not at our best, or we're showing up in a very selfish way that, I'm just here to get what I can get out of this, and I don't really care about that impact on anybody else, that then affects the environment. It starts to become toxic in the environment. And similarly, if the environment is a really positive, nurturing, regenerative environment, so if as an organisation we think about the systems and processes, we think about our vision, we think about our values, we think about the way in which we create the conditions for people to be in that system, then that helps people to thrive. That helps people to be at their best. And interestingly, the research I've done into high-performing teams and what really creates performance in teams, the only factor that we're measuring that has a direct and positive influence on what we're calling the individual's experience within the team. So that individual experience is, do I feel like I'm able to contribute my best to the team? Am I getting something in return? And remembering we're asking this question of people in teams about their team, the factor that's having the greatest influence on my experience in the team is the broader organizational context. And that broader organizational context is, do I know how I'm contributing to the bigger picture? And is the team and leadership and systems within the organization best supporting our team? So even within a team context, when we think about, I'm working with a team of people, the experience I have as an individual within that team is most influenced by my broader experience in the organisation.
That's a really interesting point. So as you were talking, Katie, it's gotten me thinking about what I mentioned earlier about the way that we sort of try to drive that accountability in ESG roadmaps and frameworks is to say, well, the accountability should all fundamentally sit with the leaders, right? The very top leaders, because they're the ones that, of course, they can't control everything, but it is their responsibility to take the business in the right direction. So kind of the very direct and clear cost impacts, or I guess, what's the word, implications of not meeting their ESG change process and the things that they've committed to in their policies and so on, impacts their pays, or their salaries, their budget, their salaries, their commissions, all of those sorts of things, right? So I'm just wondering, and I don't know, for me, I feel like this is tied into kind of what you were saying. How do we, is that the right way of thinking? Maybe that's probably the better question, is that the right way to think, that it sits with the leaders? Because obviously it's not just them within the business, there's so many different moving parts. So what are your thoughts, I guess, in general about that?
Look, everyone plays a role. There is, and if you think even just in the context of this diagram, what's everybody's mindset? What's everybody's role to play? I think there's definitely a cultural overlay to that question. In our cultural context, we certainly do look to leaders to set the tone. And we do know, I'm just reading some of the comments that come through, Michelle. I love your question. Thank you. About has the pandemic left a deep systems impact? And that came up for me just before as well. So I absolutely want to address that. But in our cultural context, we look for leaders to set the tone. We look to leaders to provide direction, and we also look to leaders for accountability. And again, interestingly, in my research, one of the most important team processes that helps a team achieve is accountability. And that is, I'm held to account and we hold each other to account. So it's not the leader of the team holds us to account. It's we hold each other and I am held to account. So I think there's a shifting mindset individually about the role that I play and taking ownership for that role, which is, sort of brings us right back to where we started around seeing my role in the system. And we also know that leaders have an exponential impact on the system. And so if leaders aren't holding people to account, if leaders aren't taking ownership of their role in the system, it's very hard in our cultural context for that to happen. Michelle, your question, we you know, and we were even talking about this last night around the lack of systems thinking in decision making in COVID and how that has left a lasting damage on our system. And if you think about human thriving and you think about the way of our being in the world with regenerative participation and caring about others, the way in which we were forced into long-term isolation and lockdown, the outcome that we were measuring, the only outcome that we were measuring our success against, and this again is quite culturally contextual to Victoria, but was deaths by COVID. And, and when we think about well-being, and we talk about this a lot, the absence of illness doesn't mean the presence of health. And so an absence of deaths from COVID doesn't mean we had a well system or a well population. We would never measure our own health and well-being on whether or not we were sick. Like, just because I'm not sick doesn't mean I'm well. And so an organisational focus on risks and hazards and the absence of risks and hazards doesn't mean the presence of well-being.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess what I wanted to kind of understand your thoughts on this as well, both of you really, because from my perspective, COVID really forced people to be with themselves. So let's talk about it. Like, obviously, it wasn't addressed properly. As you said, the main factor that defined whether we had a successful process through this COVID period was whether people died or not. And that's so, that's so single-minded, of course. But the other thing is as well, people being on their own, forced to be on their own, really forced them to also connect further with who they truly are as individuals. And so obviously what's come out of that, I feel like people are just feeling a lot more connected to their individual purposes. It obviously also did break some people, and I understand why, because you're forced to be with your own thoughts, and that can be really scary as well when you haven't addressed some of the kind of deeper issues or the trauma and all of that. So just connecting all of that back into well-being and business, maybe. Do you have any thoughts about that? The fact that COVID really forced the mirror up to people's faces, and some people broke a little bit more through that process, and others found that they were more inclined to pursue their purpose through work and their careers rather than just settle.
I actually think there's a very mixed experience depending on people's individual contexts. And so for some people, yes, it actually provided a space to think about what's really important to them and what's meaningful, and then they've made some different decisions in their life around where they work and how they work. And then there's others that it just went to 24/7 availability. They're managing their kids' schooling, plus they're managing a team. They're working globally, and we've got a lot more of that since COVID as well. A lot more of global teams working together, which means that there is less of that that sort of blur. The space between home and work is very blurred now.
Yeah.
So we've seen an increase in burnout also. So I think it's quite complex. There's lots of different things going on at the same time for different people.
So you feel the fact that, like, people's lives, which should always have been that way, right? Because who we are at home is not any different to who we should be at work, in the sense that obviously there's a level of like professionalism that happens in the workplace and whatnot, but fundamentally we're the same people, and it's interesting that now COVID has blurred those lines. So you feel like that has uprooted some challenges, like more problems?
Yeah, so I think there's some great things with that in terms of sort of authentic relationships forming and things, but at the same time, it also means that we're not recognizing some of those natural cycles about before around, being able to actually have some boundaries.
Boundaries, did you say?
Yeah, to have some downtime, to recognize the natural cycles that we can have periods when we run fast, and we need to then have rest periods where we restore. And I think those lines have been blurred for a lot of people, and that's an ongoing I think that's an ongoing issue in terms of burnout in our organisations. So Katie, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think it comes to this idea of what's the outcome that we're looking for, and it's the other part of the diagram that you haven't talked about yet. So when Cass and I were sort of working through this together, we were like, what is the outcome of a system of which wellbeing is an emergent property? What is the thing that we're actually trying to get to? And we've landed on this language around optimized potential for all, because we're not necessarily thinking about the outcome as a performance outcome, because that isn't necessarily well-being either. But how do we think about all of the components of the system in a way in which we optimize the potential for those components? And so that could be human components, that could be environmental components. So if you think about ESG and you think about all those elements of ESG, how do we optimize potential for those elements in the way in which we engage with the system? And, coming back to COVID, the way in which decisions were being made and the mindset around outcomes was a single outcome within a complex adaptive system, of which pursuing one single outcome is going to have lots of unintended consequences. So while, yes, you might achieve that single outcome of reducing death by COVID, we've had increased deaths from lots of other things because people didn't go to their oncologist and get their cancer diagnosed. People stopped going to see their psychologists, and so suicide rates went up. So you had all these unintended consequences from pursuing one single outcome rather than thinking about how do we optimize the potential for all in the system.
Well, COVID's an interesting one, right? Because it was onset so rapidly. The onset was so rapid. So, and anyways, in the best of times, most businesses are so reactive rather than proactive. So, anyways, I guess that's I think that could take us on a completely different tangent about how much better we could have responded to COVID. But I'm going to address James's question just about, accountability is correct. Like, leaders need to be accountable and take responsibility. But how do they sort of move away from a risk-based mindset? Because managing risk is obviously important in businesses. Many leaders mostly make their decisions based on risk. So even, I guess, in the case of COVID, they made their decisions based on risk, probably risk more to reputation than anything. But, how do we go about moving away from a risk-based thinking? And I guess I'm going to quickly respond only on the fact that I know that more and more ESG systems of thinking are becoming more holistic, and it's moving away from risk-based analysis and risk-based materiality and more towards impact thinking. How can we have, I guess, fundamentally better impact?
So I'd love to answer that by drawing on Juliet Burke's work, say that fast, in diversity of thinking. Yeah. And Juliet was a partner I worked with at Deloitte who really is a leading global thinker on diversity of thought. So we're moving away from diversity as a demographic visible thing into how we think and solve problems. And in her work, she's identified 6 very distinct ways of thinking in particularly how we go about making problems and solving problems and making decisions. And those 6 things are outcomes, options, people, process, evidence, and risk. And so what she's done then is worked within organisational settings to identify how many people think as a primary preference in each of these 6 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, by far and away, think about outcomes and options first. What's the outcome we're seeking and what are the options we've got to get there?
Right.
The next 2 most prevalent ways of thinking are people and process. So, how will people engage with this and how will we go about doing it? So what will the process be? And the minor, and it's a very small percentage of the population, have a first preference for thinking about what's the evidence for this and what's the risk.
Mm.
And she's found this consistently across industries. So even where we've got industries and roles that are primarily focused on we would think is risk, you see this same pattern of outcomes and options. And then when you go through organisational levels up to senior leaders, the most frightening thing is that about 80% of the preference for thinking at a senior leader population is outcomes and options. The small percentage of people that think about evidence and risk largely stays the same, so that doesn't shift, but we get this significant drop in people thinking about process and people as their first preference. Now, that's not to say we can't think about all 6. We absolutely can, but the breadth and depth to which we're able to think in our preference is significantly more than the way in which we think in our non-preference areas.
So
it also means that often those voices in those more marginalized preferences, so people who are thinking about evidence and risk, get silenced because they're not in with the majority. Yeah. So the inclusion piece is like, how do we actually include all those voices and think about those different perspectives? So I think, James, it's a really interesting question around how do we go about changing a risk mindset. But yes, Juliet does have a book, which is called Which Two Heads Are Better Than One? And it really is a brilliant...
That in the comments, that'd be wonderful, Katie.
I can't. Yeah, I'll have to see if I can. It's asking me to join the chat via YouTube, and I don't want to break it. But it's Juliet Burke, Which Two Heads Are Better Than One, published through the AICD. Brilliant. Yeah. It's easy. She also has a TED Talk. So if you look her up on TED Talk. So I would actually say the evidence around this is that leaders actually largely don't have a risk mindset. They have an outcomes mindset, and they'll pursue those outcomes at any cost.
So just to sort of, because I am conscious of time, I just want to ask, and it may be simplistic in thinking, but then does that mean that everybody should be considering all of those like categories, or because you group the 2 words together, so it's like roughly like 3 categories, should they be thinking about all 3 of them equally, or should one generally weigh more in the thinking and so on? Like, what are your thoughts?
Go, Cass.
Yeah, so and I think this is great because it brings us back to one of the components of the system of wellbeing, which is around diversity. And as systems evolve, so does they evolve through diversity. And so how do we work with our teams to make sure all of those perspectives, because we want to hear those perspectives, because that actually reduces risk, and that's part of Julia's research. Is that I think you build in, is it 20 or 30% risk? I can't remember the exact figures, by not engaging all of those different perspectives.
Okay, that's huge. So I mean, if more people knew that, then certainly they would consider all of the things equally, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and it is 6. I just say it because I remember it in those OOPPER. That's just so. But there is
group them into like 2s. But yes, you're right. There's 6 thoughts. And that's good. And Josie has put in a link here, which is wonderful. So yeah, thank you for that, Josie. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Josie.
That's really cool. Well, look, I mean, it's been really wonderful talking about this topic. It's obviously so important and probably so much more complex than even someone like myself, who I know how important it is to get everybody bought into this idea of ESG change transformation. And I know how important it is, yet I don't even understand like the depth and the complexities of this sort of thinking and what it sort of takes to really get people, just completely adopting this change and changing their mindset, which is obviously a huge thing. So it's been really informative to talk about this with you guys. Do you guys have any closing thoughts to share with the people on the call?
I'll go first if you like, Cass, and then you can round us out. So, you know, my closing thought is it starts with us individually. We're all actors within a complex system and we all have a role to play. And if we start on the left-hand side of the diagram about what am I doing for my own self-care and development, but I think really importantly, what is the mindset I have towards my own participation in that system? And am I participating in a way that I'm thinking about optimizing the potential for all, or am I participating in a way which I'm thinking about what I can take for myself?
Yeah. I like that. It all
Yeah.
starts with
So a similar thought. I was thinking about the David White poem, Start Close In. So start close in. Like what is it that you can influence with yourself? Start with your own mindset. Start, and start with working with your teams as well. What are the conditions that you put in place?
Yeah, it sounds like you both sort of came to that point. I mean, through different ways of thinking, but it's like the person, right? The individual starts with us. And we have that power to make the change. And I think that's what's important for people to realize.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. Thank you. I love those thoughts. And I just wanted to give a special thanks to some of the people who really contributed heavily to the conversation online. So James Barnes, Josie Gibson, Michelle Morrison, I can see Angela Baker as well, who's contributed quite a bit. So thank you so much to all of you and Kath English as well. Really appreciate you all being here. And I know there's a few of you who've been online. If you have any questions, just share it in the, as a comment or a post, or reach out directly to Katie, Cass, myself, it's just been such a pleasure to talk with you both. So thank you to all of you who joined as well online. Thanks so much. See you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.